Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, honorable members of the committee. My name is Mark Meckler, M-A-R-K-M-E-C-K-L-E-R, and I'm from Leander, Texas. I'm the president of Convention of States Action, and we are the organization that is moving this initiative forward nationally. I'm going to keep my remarks brief. Happy to answer questions. Y'all passed this particular application several years ago. And the intent to be here today is to remove the sunset clause. There are several states that passed this application with a sunset clause: Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas. Missouri and Oklahoma have both removed their sunset clause. Texas is in the process, I believe, will remove their sunset clause this session. The reason for that is we believe liberty never expires, first of all, and this is a fight for liberty. It is a fight to rebalance the jurisdiction between the federal and state governments. And you can rescind an application anytime you like. There is no necessity of a sunset clause. The legislature always retains the right to rescind any application at any time during a legislative session. So with or without a sunset clause, you have the ability to revisit this anytime that you feel it's necessary. Today, the federal government is out of control. Most people agree with this. It's not a partisan issue. People would like to see the power at home where they are. This is an issue, again, that crosses partisan lines. We polled this nationally. People want the power in their state legislatures. There's a reason for that. They elect you. They trust you. They have the opportunity to come here to Lincoln and actually be face-to-face with you or at home in their districts. For the average American, that is a literal impossibility with regard to their state representatives or state senators. They simply have no chance to cross paths with those people, talk to those people, or influence those people. They can actually see themselves sitting in your seats. We have grassroots activists all across the country that have come into the movement and then ultimately ended up sitting in a state legislature. This is what the framers intended. I can tell you, when I started this movement 12 years ago, I probably had a much lower impression of state legislatures than I do today. Having traveled to 49 of the 50 states and met with literally thousands of state legislators across the country, this is where the framers intended governance to take place. They had faith in you. Most of them had served in state legislatures or local councils. They knew that you would be the closest to the people, and they wanted the power closest to you, and that's what I'm here representing today. Happy to take questions, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Meckler, for your testimony. Check to see if there are any questions from the committee. Senator Lanowski.
Thank you, Chairwoman Sanders. Thank you for being here, sir. Appreciate it. So one thing you mentioned was it's a nonpartisan issue. When I was knocking doors, I had both Republicans, Democrats that loved it, and both those that hated it. Yeah. So I asked those who disliked it, what's the problem? And their biggest fear is a runaway convention. And at that point, I didn't know a whole lot about this, try to get my taste for exactly what it was. Can you explain why that wouldn't be possible, or how can we ease their fears?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. This is the most common opposition we hear to this. It's across the aisle. I would argue it's probably about 10% of folks feel this way. And it's just from a lack of understanding of the process. And let me start at the end of the process. I think that's the easiest way to answer the question. And I think Senator Lippincott did a pretty good job, so I won't go into too much detail about it. But whatever comes out of convention, and this is probably the most important thing we can all note, it's a suggestion. And personally, I could say I've never been in a meeting where suggestions were being made that I was afraid of suggestions. I might be afraid of actions that might be taken. I might disagree with them, but suggestions are just that, suggestions. And what comes out of a convention, if we can get 26 states to agree on something, are a suggestion or suggestions to the states. That is then sent out to the states for ratification, and it requires 3/4 of states, 38 states, to ratify anything that comes out of convention. I would posit this, that if you look at whether you're coming at this from a Democrat perspective, as far left as you want to go, a Republican perspective, as far right as you want to go, none of those proposals, far right or far left, could be ratified coming out of the convention. The country is far too divided. Well, I believe we're going to end up with the only things that can be ratified are things that are common sense, things like a balanced budget, term limits, things that the vast majority of Americans support.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, Mr. Meckler. You had, we spoke in the lobby and had a good conversation. I just sort of have some technical questions. I don't know if it was you or somebody else mentioned that basically Nebraska would have delegates based off congressional district. That's not spelled out in here, is it?
No, that's spelled out in the bill we'll be discussing later at
Okay.
the end of this hearing.
So does every state gets one vote,
That's correct.
and then we could send 1,000 delegates or one delegate?
Correct.
Okay. And then for a suggestion to be kicked out, does it take the same 34, or how many votes? How many
It takes a
states?
simple majority for something to come out of convention. So that would be 26 states.
Okay, 26 states. And I asked Senator Lippincott this, and you and I think, talked about it a little bit, the officials and members of Congress.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think this is really important when we're talking about term limits, and you have experience with term limits in this state. I've seen it all over the country. There is a danger to term limiting elected officials only in that you empower the bureaucrats and potentially long-term staffers to run the government, and they stay around forever. And then officials, elected officials who are responsive to their electorate, get termed out of office. And so it creates a class of people that are more powerful than the elected officials. And so when we say other federal officials, what we're referring to is staffers, bureaucrats, actually also potentially the federal judiciary. Anybody that works for the federal government could have their terms working for the federal government potentially limited under that part of the application.
But it wouldn't allow us to put limits on lobbyists or anything like that.
No, I would say unfortunately on that one, lobbyists are outside the government system, so we couldn't do that. But I would say, and I think this is important, I think you and I had a brief conversation about this as well, that I do believe that we should close that revolving door on lobbyists coming out of the federal government and then going to make millions of dollars lobbying their colleagues. And under the third part of the application, limiting the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government, an amendment could be proposed to stop that revolving door. And I personally would be in favor of that.
Okay. And yeah, just to go back to that part, the limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess there's obviously an intention.
Yes.
To propose this.
Yeah.
Is it just regulations, or what is there we're talking about?
So I think the simplest way to put it, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail as much as you would like. The simplest way to put it is when the Constitution was drafted, there were 17 enumerated powers. And those who were there drafting it said, these are the powers we're giving to the federal government and no more. And then with the 10th Amendment, we said everything else not prohibited to the states is reserved to the states and the people. Well, unfortunately, over probably the last 115 years, through a series of court decisions, the federal government has usurped a lot of state authority. I'll give you some very specific examples. The intention behind the Commerce Clause was simply to give the federal government the power to prevent interstate trade wars. Literally, in 1787, New York and New Jersey were about to go to war over trade. And they thought, well, this isn't going to work. We have to give Congress the power to deal with this. So the goal was to smooth out trade between the states. Unfortunately, the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, have interpreted that over the years to mean almost anything, that the federal government has power to regulate virtually everything. And so the goal would be to restrain that power somewhat. I'll give you some specific examples. Potentially, some people would say that there is no legal justification for the Department of Education in the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson spoke about this, actually said he couldn't spend money on University of Virginia because that would violate the Constitution. That's been held as legal by the United States Supreme Court, even though it clearly was not the intent of the framers. So there are many areas of the law where we could say, hey, we're going to push the federal government outside of this area of regulation. We're going to return that solely to the states. I would also argue, and I think it's a good way to put a bow on this, that almost everything that the federal government regulates in your state is also regulated by your state. The framers all believed that was impossible. Literally, we know the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson, big government versus small government guy. One thing that they both completely agreed upon, never debated, talked about, they agreed on it, is that government should have an exclusive sphere of influence. If the state can do it, the federal government really shouldn't, and vice versa. And so I think the goal was to move back to something closer to that.
Okay. And so would this take the form of one amendment or multiple specific amendments?
Are you saying specifically in that area?
In that area, yeah.
It could be one or more. I mean, for example, if somebody were to say, well, we want to deal with education, it could be an amendment simply saying something to the extent of the federal government shall not be involved in education. So it's just up to the folks who meet in convention. And this is according to the intent of the framers. They expected a convention to be a deliberative process. The reason that we know that is there were 11 conventions, interstate conventions before 1787. We know exactly how they worked and what the rules were. And they were used to setting out general ground rules for the convention and then getting into convention and having debates about the actual substance.
I've got one more for you that's just sort of my personal interest. would any of these allow us to put more restrictions on campaign finance and dark money and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I get asked that question all the time. The answer is no. And the reason the answer is no is because everything in this particular application is couched in terms of limiting the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. And what you're proposing would actually, in some ways, increase that power by saying to the federal government, you can impose more regulations. So there has been an effort by other groups. I don't think it's gone very far to overturn Citizens United. There's a group called Wolfpack that's out there promoting that. It would require a convention called for a different purpose.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions from the committee? Senator Anderson?
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mr. Meckler, thank you for being here. When Senator Kavanaugh mentioned the officials, and it's kind of an ambiguous term. Have you ever thought of, they have something that when you get to the general officer level, you get the senior executive scale, and that's well defined. And that's really the decision-making level and above this executive level. So any thoughts that maybe that would be a definition you could use?
I think that's something that could be proposed at convention, Senator, that specific limitation. We used a more general, again, acknowledging the fact that a convention is supposed to be a deliberative body, and we wanted to give them the room. Now, I don't propose to be smart enough or expert enough in these particular subject matter areas to know what the right exact language would be for an amendment. The intent was to sort of set the table so that folks can get into a room and debate this.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Senator Greco?
So first, thank you for being here for your testimony. For an idea to get kicked out, it's 50% of the delegates of the states.
It's a majority, simple majority, so it would be 26 states.
Now and it needs to be approved by Congress at three quarters of Congress, correct?
Congress doesn't have a role. It actually goes out to the states for ratification. It would take 3/4 of the states to ratify any amendment.
Okay. But that same 3/4 threshold doesn't apply to this legislator. Each legislator has their own process of approving it.
You mean in convention?
No. Once it's kicked back to the legislators.
Then it's up to your legislature how to ratify amendments.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
And by the way, you specify that in your constitution already, how you ratify amendments.
Thanks.
Any other questions from the committee? Senator Wardekamper?
Thank you for being here. I guess just to clarify that, so once a resolution comes back to the states to decide, it's the 49 legislature people here that decides that, or does it go to a vote of the people of the state to decide if we're moving forward with that?
A little bit of nuance in answer to that question. It says specifically in the Constitution that Congress decides the mode of ratification and specifies either legislative or state conventions. And so that means it's going to come back here with an instruction, whether your legislature will ratify or you will hold a state ratifying convention. Interestingly, a state ratifying convention is whatever the legislature says it is. And literally you could convene the legislature as a state ratifying convention and choose to do it that way. Only one time out of the 27 amendments in American history has the ratifying convention methodology ever been used, and that was for the repeal of prohibition.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I got one, Chair.
Senator Lanowski?
Thank you, Chair Sanders. Thank you again, sir. So let's say you send your delegate and everyone going to this convention has these three ideas that we want to work on. What if I say to one of the delegates, hey, I have a great idea about voting machines, or I have a great idea, and everybody starts rumbling in there, and that is a good idea. Can they take that on as well?
Are you specifically referring to voting machines or just any other?
Anything.
Okay. The answer is only things that fall within the application's 3 tenets. And the reason for that is you have authorized the convention, 34 states, a supermajority of states, saying that you're going to talk about a particular group of things. And the reason that we know this is absolutely undeniably factual, our opponents will say that we have no way to know that, is there have been over 400 applications in the history of the United States calling for a convention of states. We've never had a convention of states. And the reason is the states haven't agreed, 2/3 of the states, on what they want to talk about. So the states actually have to agree in advance. That's how we know that this is binding. Now, when you get into convention, if you think about how the convention would work, you would have 34 states that have agreed, we're only going to talk about these 3 subject matter areas. That's a super majority of any convention. So the idea that somehow then they would drift outside the bounds of those doesn't make any sense.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Greco?
But they could. That's why Senator Lippincott has introduced It'll be 259, right?
I want to clarify, when you say they could, I think the answer is any human being at a convention could raise their hand and say anything they want to say, but they would lack the authority to act on those things because they've been appointed as agents of your legislatures, and I'm saying 34, a supermajority of the legislatures. They have specific authority. Their authority derives from the legislative appointment, and the legislature has appointed them to discuss only those 3 subject matter areas. So certainly any human being could raise their hand and say anything they want, but it would be deemed out of order and non-germane to the convention.